Hi guys, welcome to Stair Shop Creates. Today we're going to be working on this mermaid themed low ball. The low ball is from Mother Tumbler. I used a few of these silicone molds I got off Amazon. I'll link all this stuff below. 3 mica powders, Heart Happy from PDB as my white glitter, Tech Wrap white opal hollow vinyl for my mermaid scales, and then this pastel Sculpey pack. So everything will get linked below, but let's get started. So I'm using the sublimation coated low ball for this because I didn't have any of the plain stainless steel in stock. So if you're using a stainless steel one, go ahead and just give it a base paint with white spray paint. If you're using the sublimation coated one like me, we need to sand it and roughen it up. So I'm just taking the sanding pad. I'm not sanding it so much that I'm sanding away the color, but I am roughening it up because if you don't, your glue and epoxy and stuff could definitely repel that sublimation coating. Okay, so like I said, just give it a good sand. Make sure you get the top, the bottom rim, all of the spots really well so that nothing repels it. All right, I'm going to be applying my glitter with the epoxy method today. Typically I would use adhesive apothecary glitter glue, but I already had to mix up some epoxy for another tumbler anyways, so I figured I would mix up a little bit extra and just do the epoxy method for this. So I'm scraping the sides and I am mixing my part A and part B in a plastic cup thoroughly with a popsicle stick. You know, you can use a metal stir or whatever you use to mix your epoxy, but I'm not mixing a ton because I only need enough to coat one tumbler and then apply glitter with this. When you're doing the epoxy method, I definitely recommend warming up your epoxy first. I did not, but it definitely helps. And you don't need a ton of epoxy in your tumbler for the epoxy method. I'm just taking a gloved finger or gloved hand and I'm applying a thin, even coat on my whole tumbler. Like I said, you don't need a lot. You just need enough for your glitter to stick. We're definitely not doing a flood coat or anything, so very minimal epoxy is needed. And make sure, once again, you're getting that top and bottom rim really well and it is coated evenly. We're going to be using Heart Happy from PDB Creative Studio. That is my favorite sparkly white glitter literally ever. So this is super easy because the entire tumbler is just coated with the same glitter, so we don't have to ombre anything. And I'm just making sure that I get even coverage and I get the edges and the bottom and the top rims really well. And then I'm going to let this dry for about 4 to 6 hours. And then I'm going to put a coat of epoxy on this to start smoothing it out. Okay, this cup took 2 coats of epoxy to get smooth, and I actually show one of the epoxy applications here in a second. So it's on my turner. That is 1 coat of epoxy, and here we are applying our second coat. It just needed the second coat to get smooth. There was still some rough parts, and you don't want to apply your vinyl to your tumbler if it is not smooth. So I'm just taking the time, and I'm putting a thin coat of epoxy on there, and I'm going to let it spin for about 6 hours. All right, let's get our decal ready while our cup is curing. I bought this SVG off of Etsy, and I just had to do a few things to kind of size it to fit my tumbler. I decided I didn't want the scales to be super small, so I am going to take a rectangle, and I'm going to slice half of those scales away. That the one at the top is what we're going for, so I'm just kind of showing you my process and how I did that. So after I slice that away, I am sizing that to 3.5 inches tall because that is how tall our tumbler is. And then I'm going to duplicate that and weld it together. And my overall dimensions were 3.5 inches high and 11 inches wide. So I cut that on my Cricut and it cut pretty fast. It was really easy. I do recommend cutting twice on your Cricut with that hollow vinyl because sometimes it doesn't always cut the whole way through. Okay. All right, guys, our tumbler has 2 coats of epoxy on it and it was fully coated. So let's give it a good sand around the bottom rim and top rim so that when we apply our vinyl, we are making sure that it is going on a very smooth surface. So if you have any bumps, you want to sand those away. If for some reason your tumbler is still very rough, you may want to put another coat of epoxy on it. All right, we are going to weed out all of the inside scales. out of our cut. I wanted an outline of the scale, so I am weeding out all of the insides. If you wanted it to be more of a fill design, you would weed off the outlines. So I guess it's just a personal preference, but this vinyl weeds away really nice. I didn't want to use a weeding pen because sometimes it just takes longer, and it was easier for me to just kind of pick each scale up with my fingers and do it that way. Right, we're going to apply a huge piece of transfer tape over the whole thing and make sure it is smooth and there's no creases or bubbles. So that's why we are using this squeegee, because we want this application to go as smooth as possible. This vinyl can be a little tricky sometimes, so take your time when we're applying it. To make it a little easier on ourselves, we are going to trim off all of that excess. I think it's easier to apply a full wrap like this after you've trimmed off any excess, just so it doesn't really get in the way. And I'm cutting pretty close to my design, but I'm trying not to cut away any actual parts of the vinyl. All right, we are going to take our cup cradle from Cowbell Custom Designs. She 3D prints them, and we are going to wrap this around our whole cup. We're just trying to get a visual on if it's going to meet up, if we cut it right, stuff like that. So after I know that it is lined up correctly, I'm going to hold this piece down with my finger, and I'm going to start peeling away a little bit of the transfer tape so that I can cut some of that white backing off. I tried to use an X-Acto knife and it didn't work, so then I went and I grabbed the scissors. So as you can see, I'm holding everything in place with one hand and cutting with the other hand. I can't stress it enough. Just take your time. So now that I stuck that little part on, I can go in and kind of start peeling away all of that white backing. And as I am peeling it away, I'm taking my squeegee, and this just helps apply it smoother, especially with these little tumblers. The squeegee is as tall as the tumbler, so it makes the whole process pretty fast and easy. And I'm making sure that there's no creases. Here we're going to peel up the other side so our transfer tape does not overlap, and we're going to finish laying it. I did have a little bit of an overlap, but that's okay with me because I can trim it, or I'm going to be putting 3D pieces on this anyways, so I'll just make sure when I'm doing my 3D pieces that I put it over that part. Peel off all your transfer tape, rub down any areas that are still sticking, and then we're going to take our X-Acto knife and kind of trim off the top a little bit because they were hanging over just a little bit. I need a new X-Acto knife. This one it's been through it. All right, guys, let's start our clay process. This is the purple clay from the pastel pack I linked below, and we are using our mermaid tail silicone mold. Right now I'm just kind of working the clay in my hands and with my clay roller to soften it up, and now we're going to start putting it in our mold little by little and pressing down because you really want to get the detail of that mold in the clay. So make sure you fill all the gaps. I think I'd used pretty much this whole block of clay for this mermaid tail. I had a tiny bit left over. I'll push that in there really good. And then I like to take my clay roller to flatten it out. It just makes the whole process go smoother if I kind of roll it in there and smooth it out. Now we are going to peel it off, and we're going to start trimming it with our X-Acto knife. Here I noticed that I had a little bit of black clay in there, so I actually scraped that off and then put it back in my mold, and I got a little frustrated, rolled it back into a ball, and repeated the whole process again. But that's fine. You can also sculpt this by hand if that's what you want to do. I don't think I'm there yet with clay where I can sculpt things, but it's definitely something I want to try. But these molds just kind of make it a little bit easier. Once again, just make sure you're trimming off all of the excess with your X-Acto knife or whatever tools you choose to do. Here is when I got... I don't know what I was about to say there. I got frustrated and redid it, so now I'm trimming it off again. Excuse that little mess up there. If you don't get it perfect the first time, this clay is just so easy to use, so you can literally just roll it back up and put it back in the mold like I did. All right, here it is. So right now I'm putting it on my low ball. I'm putting it on my low ball because I kind of want to establish my shape. I obviously have to bend it a little bit to make it fit. So that's what I am doing here. And then it made it a little easier for me to see any parts that needed trimmed a little bit more. I actually did not bake it on the sublimation tumbler, and I'll tell you why. I didn't know if the sublimation tumbler was safe to put in my oven, whereas the stainless steel ones are. So I actually end up transferring it to a coffee mug because it was about the same diameter. Here I'm taking that little bit of clay I had left over and seeing how Pedal Pusher from PDB looked on that color before I did the whole thing, and it was really beautiful. So I'm just taking a dry brush and I am brushing mica powder all over it. I'm not worried about being a little messy, but this just kind of makes the clay shimmer a little bit more, and I really loved the results of it. It was a really beautiful glitter mica. And I'm getting the edges and all of that fun stuff. If you have any creases or dents in your clay, you can also take a paintbrush and rubbing alcohol and kind of smooth those out as well. I don't think I really had any areas that needed smoothed out, but like I said, if you need to, you totally can. Yep, here I am. I actually did have a little area, so I just kind of took my paintbrush, dipped in rubbing alcohol, and smoothed that out a little bit. And then we're going to transfer this to our coffee mug. Come on, Alyssa, get to the next step. Clearly, I took my time with this. I wanted it to be perfect. Trimming off a little bit more. Okay, now I'm adding just a little bit more mica where, because I missed a few spots when I was taking the time to kind of smooth out some creases and stuff. So, mica powder is a really good option to get your clay nice and sparkly. I forget who taught me this, but it is totally safe to, put the mica on the clay and then bake it that way. Listen, I'm just hoping that I hurry up and get to the next step because I don't have anything else to tell you at the moment. Oh my gosh, no, I do. Okay, so this is something that I didn't understand when I started clay. This is clay that you bake, okay? So you can bake a stainless steel tumbler with your clay on it, and that is how it holds its shape. And that's something I never really understood. I'm like, how are people putting the clay on epoxy tumblers and then baking it? Like, you can't do that. So we are actually going to transfer this to our coffee mug and then put it in the oven. I chose this coffee mug because it's relatively the same width. Ignore that other mermaid tail that I was working on. So I can bake it on this coffee mug and it'll still hold the shape and fit on my low ball as well. So I'm kind of just placing it on the coffee mug. I'm pushing down a little bit because I don't want it to fall off, and then I'm just bending it as I seem necessary. I bake this at 275 degrees Fahrenheit, and it says to bake 15 minutes per 1/4 inch, and this was about 1 inch thick, so I baked it for about 45 minutes to an hour. I use my best judgment, but that's going to vary, on what your oven is. Now I'm taking the gold clay from that same pastel pack, and I am using another mold because I really loved the starfish in this. And I'm just doing the same exact process. I'm putting it in the mold, I'm pressing it down, and then we will remove it from the mold. Okay, so just make sure you get all of those areas of the mold and you're not missing any at all. I love this gold. It does actually have a shimmer to it already, but I ended up adding some mica powder to it anyways because I wanted extra gold and extra sparkly. All right. Use your roller, that'll just apply pressure to make sure you get all the detail, and now we can peel it off. And once again, we're just going to take our X-Acto knife and we are going to trim off all of that extra clay. This starfish literally had so much detail. I did link all 3 molds that I'll be using below. Unfortunately, I didn't get them all from the same seller, but they are all on Amazon. Okay. I like to use an X-Acto knife for this process. I don't know if there's like a special clay tool that works for it, but the X-Acto knife just cuts it so smoothly and I never have any issues with it. Okay, and then we are going to brush some mica powder on this. I use the 24 karat from PDB Creative Studio because this is the gold mica powder that matched the clay the most. So we're going to repeat that same process that we did with the mermaid tail for this one. I took a second to just kind of place it on my tumbler and make sure that this is what I wanted to do. Ignore that blue seashell. I didn't end up using it, so I didn't show you that process. But here I'm just applying the seashell to the coffee mug, and I'm going to bake that as well. I went ahead and did 2 more tiny seashells because the tumbler, I just felt like it needed a little more. So I'm using the same gold clay, the same mica powder, the same process that I did for the other 2 pieces. These were a lot easier because they're so tiny. And those baked for about 20 minutes because they weren't super thick. I originally was just going to go with the mermaid tail on the tumbler, but when I was looking through the rest of my molds, I was like, no, this totally needs seashells too. So that's why I kind of did all of these seashells in different steps because I kept adding and adding. But you could 100% do all of your clay, put them all on your tumbler, and bake it all at the same time to save yourself time. Just make sure that if you choose to do it that way, these little pieces right here are much thinner than the mermaid tail, so these would not need to bake as long. So if you choose to bake them all at the same time, you're going to want to make sure that you're taking these pieces out first. Or you can do what I'm doing and just bake them all separately, wait till they're done, and pop the rest in the oven. This is the 24 karat gold mica. As you can see, it pretty much matches the clay really well. This just gives it that extra sparkle, so it matches everything else. It turned out really, really amazing, honestly. I don't think I've ever used this mica powder before, but I'm probably going to start using it all the time now. These two pieces were really easy. I didn't have to trim off like any clay or smooth anything out. They're really small, but they have a lot of detail, and the detail transferred to the clay really, really beautifully. All right, so I'm going to bake that too and let everything cool. All right, guys, finally we're done with the clay, so we are going to glue everything. I like to glue it with liquid fusion because it dries pretty fast. You could use UV resin or epoxy, whatever you want. I did not edit that out. I wanted you guys to be able to laugh at me. I just wiped it off with a baby wipe and then tried again. I haven't used that glue in a couple days, so I guess it just wanted to all come out at once. 10 out of 10 stars. So I apply my glue to the back of my clay piece, and I like to use a paintbrush to smooth it out. It just kind of helps me decide if I have way too much glue on there, and this just also lets, glue get around all the edges and stuff. And you see how it has that curve? So since we baked it on that tumbler, it held that shape really, really well. Just make sure you're not baking it on a tumbler that already has glitter and epoxy or stuff, because that'll give you a really huge mess, and then you probably wouldn't be able to use your oven anymore. All right, so now we are going to put it right on there. I like to hold it in place for about a minute, and then it's usually good to go after that. It does take about 15 minutes to a half hour to dry fully, but I'll usually just kind of put pressure on it for about a minute so that I know it's not sliding around. Okay. Now we are going to glue our little starfish, same exact process. I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to arrange these on the cup, but you'll see at the end I kept the starfish below the mermaid tail, and then the other 2 little seashells I kind of just placed wherever I thought looked best. So I'm just adding a little bit more glue on the ends because this one I am a little worried about it popping up. So I held this one down in place for about 2 minutes. Okay, make sure you're putting pressure on the ends and that they are really stuck there. Okay. Now let's do our last 2 little pieces. We're almost done, guys. We're getting there. I do recommend letting this piece dry for a couple hours. I know liquid fusion dries 15 minutes to a half hour, but you want to make sure that glue is really fully cured before you epoxy it. I actually even think I let it set overnight, but a few hours should also be good. This cup does not fit on the cup cradle, obviously, so it's bouncing around a lot. And then I was going to put that little seashell up there, but I didn't love it, so I kind of moved it around a little bit. I don't know. It wasn't speaking to me. See, so I pulled them off and I just kind of re-glued so I could reapply them. This is literally so cute. I love how it turned out so much. Okay, we're putting that one more in the middle, and then this little guy is going to go next to the starfish, still under the mermaid tail. All right, and then that's it. We're going to let this dry for a couple hours or overnight, whatever you choose, before we start to epoxy. All right, guys, this epoxy process is a little different, so I'm going to show you how I do it. I mix about 30 mLs of part A and part B of a little extra epoxy. I'm going to be honest, that's probably entirely way too much for this tumbler, but I always do extra because I always have tumblers sitting around that need epoxied anyways, and I'd rather have more epoxy than not have enough. So equal parts of part A and part B. I did warm this up a little bit in front of my space heater so that it was a little easier to work with. And we are going to mix those two parts together thoroughly. I use a popsicle stick. I honestly don't really notice a difference if I use a popsicle stick or a metal stick or a silicone stick. It really all matters if I warm up my epoxy ahead of time, if I get air bubbles. So I'm just putting one part into the other, making sure you're scraping all of the sides and you have a glove on your hand. I should have put a glove on my other hand too. I have spray paint literally still on my hands. So if you're wondering what's on my hand, that is it. So mix slow. If you start whipping it and mixing it really fast, then that's when you'll get air bubbles. I'm adding a little bit of fairy dust into my epoxy to make it shimmer. Not gonna lie, you don't need a lot of this. I put entirely way too much, but it looked really amazing on the cup anyways, so I wasn't too worried about that. But this will always add extra shimmer. So first I take a gloved hand and I start to do around the clay pieces. I'm not doing a super thick coat. If you do a really thick coat of epoxy with clay pieces, it can start to pull and collect around your clay. So I like to work with thin coats. You know, if I need to put one final layer of epoxy on after this, that's fine by me. But I'm working around the clay pieces first and smoothing it out the best that I can. And I'm actually going to use a paintbrush to apply the epoxy over the clay pieces. This was recommended to me and it helped a ton. I did end up turning off my spinner and spinning it by hand while I use that paintbrush and I apply epoxy very carefully around everything. I do try and spin it a little bit so that all the epoxy I put on first doesn't start to drip down. And yeah, I would just recommend a paintbrush for this. Make sure you're getting into all of the cracks and crevices and you're not missing any spots. I will tell you that this cup did need one final coat of epoxy anyways, so I wasn't really worried about getting it perfect. Especially with that starfish, you know, it has a lot of detail and indents, so you just want to make sure you are coating it really well. And thin coats is key. I can't stress it enough. If you use too much epoxy, it will collect around all of those pieces. So I even took my paintbrush and kind of pulled some epoxy away from around the clay pieces just so that I could make sure that it wasn't going to bubble up there. I'm taking a torch to pop any bubbles and we're going to let this spin overnight. I'm not using a fast set epoxy, so it does have a longer drying time. Here is an up close on how beautiful and sparkly this piece is. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and we're going to add one more thing when this is dry, and then we'll be able to put on our final coat and be done. So first things first, this is cured now. We need to sand our rim. One, because it's a little rough. Two, you want to have a little bit of stainless steel showing on your tumbler, and that will allow you to have a very good seal. Okay, so most creators like to take a Dremel or something and show the stainless steel a little bit, and that allows it to have the best seal possible. So I really like to use a Dremel for this. I've been using this Dremel for years, and it is by far my favorite one. I don't use the flap wheel, I just use that tool. The last thing I'm going to do is take this Art Deco gold pen, and I'm just going to add a few little dots to my mermaid tail. You don't have to do this, but I wanted to be able to add a little bit of gold to the mermaid tail to coordinate with the gold seashells. And you're going to let that Art Deco paint dry probably for 24 hours. And after that, you can put your final coat of epoxy on it, and you will be done. So if you have any questions, please ask them below and let me know. I hope that you learned a lot from this tutorial. I voiced it over probably 14 times because I kept messing up. But if you choose to make this too, please tag me because I would love to see. Here is the final result. Thanks, guys.